Meanwhile, President Trump has restarted nuclear talks with North Korea after making a historic visit over the weekend. He became the first sitting U.S. president to visit the isolated country. He crossed the DMZ and held an unprecedented meeting with Kim Jong Un. Despite the historic visit and previous summits, though, North Korea still has all of its nuclear weapons. Chip Reid is following the latest at the White House.
Well, so far there has been no tangible progress toward any kind of denuclearization deal. The parties are simply heading back to the negotiating table after talks broke down earlier this year. And meanwhile, North Korea continues to produce materials for nuclear weapons.
We've agreed that we're each going to designate a team, and the team will try and work out some details. And again, speed is not the object. We want to see if we can do a really comprehensive, good deal.
Moments before leaving South Korea, President Trump said sanctions against North Korea are still in place, but he left open the possibility of scaling them back.
At some point during the negotiation, things can happen. I'd be very proud to do that. Okay, let's do it. Come on.
Earlier in the day, with one footstep, the president made history as the first U.S. president to enter North Korea. The impromptu meeting unfolded after President Trump tweeted an invitation to the North Korean leader the day before. CBS News has learned the president didn't give his staff much of a heads up about the tweet invitation, but he has been trying to replicate what South Korean President Moon Jae-in did when he met Kim at the DMZ last year. But the Kim-Trump meeting wasn't the only dramatic moment. New White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham was bruised after getting into a scuffle with North Korean security guards who appeared to be blocking American reporters from the meeting room, where President Trump and Kim spoke privately for nearly an hour. Back home, Democratic presidential candidates expressed concern that the U.S. made no gains.
This country is no safer when it comes to North Korea.
He keeps having these summits and meetings that really don't produce anything.
An initial meeting between U.S. and North Korean officials is expected to happen sometime in the next few weeks. President Trump has made clear he wants Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to be his lead negotiator, but the North Koreans previously made clear they want him nowhere near the negotiating table. Meanwhile, President Trump also said he's going to invite President Kim to the White House for a meeting, but so far there are no details. Anne-Marie?
Chip Reid, thank you so much. So for a closer look at this, let us bring in CBSN contributor and Asia Society Senior Fellow, Isaac Stone-Fish. He's joining us now from Berlin. Isaac, thank you so much for joining us. So let's talk about what we saw. Some Democrats and other critics have said, hey, great photo op, President Trump, but did this amount to anything? Others have said, listen, it's worse than a photo op because all those pictures are going to be used to bolster Kim Jong Un and in North Korea. So let me get your take on it. When it comes to substance, was anything really accomplished here?
Well, it's certainly a historic moment in that Trump set foot in North Korea as a sitting president. In terms of substance, it is much harder to say. It seems like the United States is shifting away from a desire to denuclearize North Korea, which would be fantastic, but seems incredibly unrealistic, and more towards a freeze, which is replicating what previous administrations had done. I think this will be a substantive meeting if it does lead to North Korea being less of an international threat. But it is difficult for Trump to say that the last several years of tensions really brought us any closer to a denuclearized North Korea.
Do images like that legitimize Kim Jong Un, like some critics say? And is that a bad thing? Why is that a bad thing?
It's so hard to know what's legitimizing North Korea domestically. It's the world's most opaque country. We have very little idea about what is actually keeping Kim Jong Un, one of the world's most awful dictators, in power. I think the question for the United States is whether or not North Korea, led by Kim Jong Un, is worse for American interests and for American safety than a North Korea ruled by whoever his successor might be. Now, if Kim Jong Un does fall from power, it's difficult to know if his successor will be some general who is more aggressive towards U.S. interest, or maybe North Korea will move on the slow path towards democracy, which is what a lot of people hope. So I think it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't.
You alluded to something that the New York Times is reporting this morning. The New York Times is saying that the administration is considering asking North Korea to freeze its nuclear weapons as opposed to completely dismantling its operation. How significant is that?
That's significant in that it represents a very large change of strategy for the Trump administration. It's not significant in historic context because a lot of other presidents have tried that policy under different names. The idea being, okay, well, we know North Korea is not going to give up its nukes. Maybe we don't really want to talk about that publicly because it's a little embarrassing to do so. So we'll just try to keep them at the status quo. The Obama administration called a similar strategy strategic patience. And it seems like the Trump administration is moving in that direction. And I think it's probably a pretty good strategy because we have to remember, too, that North Korea poses a very large threat towards Seoul with its stockpile of conventional weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. And the nuclear weapons are just a part of the problem. And the real problem is North Korea making threats to the outside world and also the horrific things it does to its own people.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because it certainly seems like human rights violations, it's something that doesn't come up at all. It doesn't seem to register for this administration, but not just this administration. I mean, this has happened before, right? Where when it comes to creating alliances or treaties, sometimes human rights violations are overlooked. Do you expect that it will come up in conversation at all?
No, probably not. I think it'll come up in a lot of the Democratic candidates' critique of Trump administration policy, but I don't think it's going to come up in conversations between Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump. It's certainly possible that Trump will continue to bring up the case of Otto Warmbier, the University of Virginia student who died after being returned from North Korea, but it's very unlikely that he'll bring up any of the North Korean human rights abuses against North Korea's own people. And yes, this is something that Trump is being negligent in, and also a lot of other ex-US presidents have been negligent in, and it's not only with North Korea, it's also with our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which again is something Trump is doing, but there's a lot of history with that, with the Obama administration, the Bush administration, basically every other U.S. administration over the last several decades.
Yeah. The President Trump places a lot of weight on his personal relationships, his ability to sort of, schmooze with these world leaders. And, his sort of strategy is almost opposite to the strategy we've seen before. Normally, we see sort of underlings gather together. There are meetings. They hammer out an agreement. And really, the world leaders show up to sort of give the ceremonial signature and shake hands. With President Trump, it's the opposite, right? It's him trying to sort of cobble together some sort of personal relationship with the top leader and then working backwards. And that's what we saw over the weekend. He said, listen, we're going to restart these meetings. We admire each other so much. But that's exactly what happened after the last summit. And then the meetings fell apart. U.S. officials complained that North Korea just simply wouldn't show up, or they wouldn't agree to a date to actually meet. So why should we believe the president that something is different now?
We shouldn't, but I think we can give him credit for changing strategy and actually going and talking with the North Koreans. I think even in the depths of the Cold War, U.S. presidents would still meet with Soviet leaders, and it's good to have the lines of conversation open. At the same time, I don't think we should believe that things are going to be different this time, or that North Korea is going to suddenly be an easy country to negotiate with. I mean, this has been a problem for decades, in part because they're really, really good at this type of brinksmanship, and they're really good at mortgaging their own people's happiness and economic development to present this united front against the world. So it's a very, very difficult problem that Trump is facing. And I think whether or not it's going to succeed depends in part on what the North Koreans decide to do in the lead up to the election, whether or not they decide to, say, test another nuclear weapon or test a ballistic missile right before the election next November, which really could change the way that Trump sees this.
Hey, listen, before I let you go, Isaac, I got to ask you about Xi Jinping. So, and the trade war between China. The president has decided not to continue escalating the trade war, in that he will not be adding more tariffs to Chinese goods, but he's not scaling back the ones that are already in place after meeting with Xi Jinping. So, good news. What's your take on this announcement?
It's a major weekend for Asia news. I think one thing that's really important to remember is that although the president has signaled that Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, will be treated better in the States because of the meeting over this weekend, that doesn't change the relationship that Huawei has with the Chinese Communist Party and with the Communist Party's military, the People's Liberation Army. And so we have to remember that even as the U.S. inserts Huawei into this political debate, it doesn't change the nature of Huawei and doesn't change the nature of Huawei's relationship with the Chinese state. And of course, as far as I know, there are no agreements in terms of trade. I mean, this whole thing started because the president felt like there was an unequal trade relationship between the U.S. and the U.S. and China, and also that there were not enough protections for intellectual property and that sort of thing. And none of that is actually changed, as far as I know. I think what has changed is that things do seem less dire in terms of what the business community wants. I think we've seen some of the global markets reflecting positively to this news. And I will say, in Trump's defense, a lot of those frustrations that you just cited about intellectual property do really reflect frustrations that many in the business community and the China watching community have felt for a long time in terms of the way that Beijing conducts trade globally. So we are still in a time of shifting plates with the U.S.-China relationship, and it's really going to be fascinating to see what comes of this.
All right, Isaac Stonefish, thank you very much.
Thank you.